They say some men find gold, some find God, but Boone Mercer found a baby, crying from a saddlebag he stole under a blood-red dawn, wrapped in wool, beside a bounty poster offering $5,000 for its death. The plains were quiet when Boone Mercer spotted the stray horse tied outside the ruined chapel. Dawn was breaking over the mesa, painting the sky in shades of rust and ember, each color bleeding into the next like watercolors on wet paper. The old church stood like a broken tooth against the horizon, its bell tower crumbled from years of wind and neglect, its wooden cross tilted at an angle that suggested God had turned his back on this place long ago. Weeds grew through cracks in the stone foundation, and the wooden doors hung open like a mouth frozen in a silent scream. The silence was absolute, broken only by the whisper of wind through sage and the distant cry of a hawk circling overhead. Even the insects seemed to hold their breath, as if the very air around the chapel was cursed. Boone had seen places like this before, places where violence had soaked into the earth so deep that nothing clean could grow there anymore. Boone had been riding hard for 3 days, living on jerky and creek water, his own horse finally giving out near Copper Ridge. The animal had been faithful, carrying him through Apache country and across the alkali flats without complaint. But even the strongest horse had limits. He'd left the poor beast to die with dignity under a cottonwood, taking only his saddle, his rifle, and the weight of mistakes that followed him like buzzards circling carrion. The memory of that horse's final moments haunted him. The way its eyes had gone glassy, the labored breathing that had finally stopped as the sun reached its zenith. He'd stayed with it until the end, one hand on its neck, whispering the kind of words a man saves for dying friends. It was the least he could do for a creature that had carried him faithfully through hell and back. He didn't question luck. You didn't out here, not in country that could kill you for hesitating or thinking too hard about providence. The desert had its own rules, its own sense of justice, and questioning a gift was the kind of luxury that got men killed. You took what was given and rode before someone changed their mind or pulled iron. The frontier had taught him that much. Survival meant moving forward, not looking back at what you'd left behind. But even as he approached the horse, something felt wrong. The animal was too calm, too well-groomed for a stray. Its coat gleamed in the morning light, and its tack was the kind of expensive leather that spoke of money and care. A horse like this didn't just wander into the middle of nowhere and wait patiently for the first rider to claim it. Boone swung himself into the saddle without a thought, not knowing the moment his boots hit the stirrups. The rest of his life had already shifted course like a river changing direction after a flash flood. The leather creaked beneath him, familiar and comfortable, and for a moment he allowed himself to relax. Whatever had brought this horse to him, he was grateful for it. The horse was a good one, shod, strong-legged, still had water on its coat like it had run through a creek in the pre-dawn darkness. Its flanks were solid muscle, unmarked by spur or whip, the kind of conditioning that came from regular exercise and good feed. This was a mount that had been cared for, fed well, treated with the kind of respect that came from understanding the difference between a horse and mere transportation. The animal's eyes were clear and intelligent, dark brown with flecks of gold that caught the morning light, and it responded to his touch with the easy grace of a creature that had known good hands all its life. The bit was silver, polished to a mirror shine, and the reins were soft leather that had been oiled and maintained with the kind of attention that spoke of pride in craftsmanship. Even the stirrups were perfectly adjusted, as if the previous rider had been close to Boone's own height and build. It was almost as if the horse had been waiting specifically for him. The saddle, too, was of a kind rarely seen west of Fort Sutherland, polished leather the color of fresh tobacco, with intricate tooling that spoke of skilled craftsmanship. Silver studs caught the morning light like stars, and the cantle was carved with patterns that reminded Boone of the work he'd seen in Santa Fe, where Spanish artisans still practiced their trade. The bedroll was too clean to have been dragged through the flats long, and the saddlebags were made of the same high-quality leather, with brass buckles that gleamed like gold. Even the horse's tack told a story of wealth and care. The bridle was decorated with silver conchos, each one polished to perfection, and the headstall was adjustable with the kind of precision that came from being fitted by someone who understood horses. The breast collar was adorned with turquoise stones, each one carefully set and secured, and the whole ensemble spoke of a rider who had both the means and the desire to own the finest equipment money could buy. He was already 15 miles out, the horse moving with a smooth gait that ate up the miles without effort, its hooves finding purchase on the rocky ground with the sure-footedness of an animal that had traveled this country before. The sun climbed higher, painting the landscape in harsh yellows and browns, and Boone began to feel the familiar rhythm of the trail settling into his bones. This was what he knew, what he understood, the open country, the endless sky, the simple act of moving forward into whatever lay ahead. The horse's gait was smooth as silk, a running walk that covered ground efficiently without jarring the rider. Boone found himself relaxing for the first time in days, letting his body settle into the rhythm of the animal's movement. The country spread out around them in all directions, broken only by the occasional mesa or dry wash, and for a moment he allowed himself to imagine that he was just another cowboy heading for distant pastures, carrying nothing more dangerous than a rope and a running iron. But then the saddlebag kicked. At first, he thought it a rabbit, maybe a prairie dog that had somehow gotten itself trapped in the leather pouch, its small body thrashing against the confines of its prison. The movement was sudden, insistent, the kind of frantic struggling that spoke of panic and desperation. But then the sound came, soft, wet, unmistakable, a cry that cut through the morning air like a blade through silk, high and thin and utterly human. The sound froze Boone's blood in his veins. He'd heard that cry before, in dreams and nightmares, in the echoes of memory that haunted his darkest hours. It was the sound of new life, of something small and helpless calling out for protection in a world that had already proven itself hostile and dangerous. Boone reined in hard, heart jackrabbiting against his ribs like a caged animal trying to escape. The horse danced sideways, sensing his sudden tension, its ears forward and alert. Every instinct told him to run, to spur the horse into a gallop, and leave whatever was in that saddlebag behind. But the cry came again, weaker now, more desperate, and something deep in his chest clenched like a fist. His hand moved instinctively to his Colt, though what threat could make that sound he couldn't fathom. The weight of the gun was familiar and comforting, cold metal against his palm, but it offered no protection against the fear that was beginning to build in his chest. This was a different kind of danger, one that couldn't be faced with bullets and hard words. He dismounted slow, every sense alert, his boots hitting the ground with sounds that seemed unnaturally loud in the morning stillness. The plains stretched empty in all directions, broken only by sagebrush and the occasional wind-carved stone that stood like sentinels against the sky. But that cry came again, weaker now, more desperate, with a quality that spoke of exhaustion and growing panic. Human. Impossibly, undeniably human. The realization hit him like a physical blow. Whatever was in that saddlebag, it was alive, it was human, and it was depending on him for survival. The weight of that responsibility settled on his shoulders like a lead blanket, and for a moment he considered mounting up and riding away. He'd never asked for this, never wanted the burden of another life on his conscience. One hand near his Colt, the other unbuckling the flap with fingers that trembled despite his efforts to steady them. The leather was warm from the sun and the horse's body heat, and there was a smell, not unpleasant, but organic, alive, the kind of scent that spoke of humanity in its most basic form. Inside was a wool blanket, damp and iron-scented, the color of winter storms, soft and carefully woven. The blanket was good wool, the kind that cost real money, and it was wrapped around something small and precious. Boone could feel the weight of it in his hands, could sense the life and warmth beneath the fabric. His heart hammered against his ribs as he prepared to pull the blanket back, not knowing what he would find but already dreading it. He pulled the blanket back carefully, as if it might contain a coiled rattler ready to strike. The wool fell away in soft folds, revealing what lay beneath. Then tiny fingers, pale skin, a baby, a newborn. The sight hit him like a punch to the gut, driving the air from his lungs and leaving him gasping. The child was impossibly small, impossibly fragile, its skin still wrinkled and red from birth. It couldn't have been more than a few days old, maybe less. Its face was red and scrunched, tiny features compressed into an expression of newborn outrage, its fists balled like it had been born mad at the world and everyone in it. The baby was perfect, 10 fingers, 10 toes, a shock of dark hair that stood up in all directions like it had been touched by lightning. The child's eyes were closed, but its mouth worked soundlessly, searching for something that wasn't there, the instinctive rooting motion that spoke of hunger and need. It was so small, so fragile, that Boone found himself holding his breath, afraid that any sound might somehow harm it. The baby's skin was soft and warm, with the translucent quality of something newly made. Its tiny chest rose and fell with rapid, shallow breaths, and its hands moved in the random, uncontrolled gestures of the very young. Despite its obvious distress, there was something beautiful about it, something that spoke of infinite possibility and hope, but it was also terrifying in its vulnerability. This was a creature that depended completely on others for survival, that would die within hours without care and protection. The weight of that responsibility was staggering, and Boone felt his knees go weak as the full implications of what he'd found began to sink in. Next to the baby, stuffed into the corner of the bag like an afterthought, was a wanted poster. The paper was yellowed and creased, as if it had been folded and unfolded many times, but the words were clear enough to stop Boone's heart cold. The ink was black and stark against the aged paper, and the letters seemed to jump out at him like living things. $5,000 reward, dead or alive, infant male, no name, child of Ezekiel Quinn. The poster was official, with the seal of the territorial government and the signature of a federal marshal. Someone had gone to considerable expense and trouble to have these made, and the reward was more money than most men saw in a lifetime. $5,000 for the death of a baby who couldn't even hold up its own head. Boone stared at the poster until the words blurred, his vision swimming with a combination of shock and growing rage. The name hit him like a bullet between the ribs, bringing with it a flood of memories he'd tried to bury in the deepest corners of his mind. Ezekiel Quinn, dead 10 years, but his legend lived on. The kind of name that mothers used to scare children into obedience, that lawmen spoke in hushed tones over whiskey and regret. Quinn had been a man who cast a shadow longer than his body, who could ride through a town and leave it changed forever. They said he'd killed 30 men, robbed twice as many banks, and had never been caught because he was too smart and too mean to die. Some claimed he wasn't even human, that he'd made a deal with something dark and hungry that lived in the spaces between worlds. The stories about Quinn were the stuff of nightmares. They said he could draw faster than lightning, shoot straighter than death itself, that he'd burned entire towns just to cover his tracks, that he'd killed men for looking at him wrong. But worst of all were the stories about his cruelty, about the way he'd toy with his victims before ending their lives, about the smile he wore when he pulled the trigger. Boone had seen him once in a saloon in Bitter Creek. Quinn had been playing cards, quiet as a church mouse, but there was something in his eyes that made grown men look away. He'd been smaller than the stories suggested, almost delicate, with pale skin and dark hair that he kept carefully combed. But there had been something wrong with him, something that made the air around him feel cold and dangerous. When he'd finally walked out of that saloon, nobody had spoken for a full minute. It was as if his presence had sucked all the warmth and life out of the room, leaving nothing but fear and the metallic taste of approaching violence. Even the piano player had stopped mid-song, his hands frozen over the keys like he was afraid to make a sound. The baby mewled, wiggled, bringing Boone back to the present with jarring suddenness. The child's movement was weak but determined, and its cries were growing stronger. It was hungry, probably hadn't eaten since birth, and its small body was beginning to show the effects of dehydration and exhaustion. Boone picked him up with both hands like something fragile and explosive, his calloused fingers gentle against the baby's soft skin. The child was warm, surprisingly heavy for something so small, and at his touch, the crying stopped. Two dark eyes opened and fixed on Boone's face with an intensity that seemed impossible for something so new to the world. Those eyes were old, ancient, as if they'd seen things that no child should ever witness. They were the color of storm clouds, dark gray with flecks of silver, and they held Boone's gaze with unwavering focus. For a moment, it felt as if the baby was looking not at him, but through him, seeing into the darkest corners of his soul. "Hell," he muttered, his voice rough with emotion. The single word seemed to break the spell, and the baby's face crumpled as it began to cry again. The sound was thin and desperate, the cry of something that had been abandoned and was afraid of being abandoned again. Boone found himself rocking the child instinctively, making soft, shushing sounds that seemed to calm it somewhat. He thought about leaving it, just setting it down under a mesquite tree and riding west toward the setting sun, leaving the child to whatever fate awaited it. It'd be easier, simpler. He hadn't asked for this, hadn't wanted the weight of another life on his shoulders. He was a thief, a drifter, a man who lived day to day without looking too far ahead or too far back. The practical part of his mind laid out the logic with cold precision. The baby would die anyway, probably within hours. The desert was no place for something so fragile and helpless. At least if he left it now, he wouldn't have to watch it suffer. He could ride away and tell himself that he'd done what he could, that some things were beyond the power of any man to change. But then he remembered Arizona, a scorched farmhouse under a merciless sun, the smell of smoke and death hanging heavy in the air. A woman with kind eyes and gentle hands who had believed in him when no one else would. A baby grave he never dug because he'd been too much of a coward to stay, too afraid of what he might become if he tried to be someone better. The memory hit him like a physical blow, driving the air from his lungs and leaving him gasping. Sarah Martinez. She'd been 22, with a laugh that could make you forget the desert heat and eyes that saw the good in everyone, even in a man like him. She'd loved him despite his profession, despite the blood on his hands and the darkness in his past. She'd believed he could change, that he could become the kind of man who built things instead of destroying them. They talked about it late at night, lying in her bed while the desert wind rattled the windows. She'd painted pictures with her words, described the life they could have together, the children they might raise, the home they could build. For a few precious months, he'd allowed himself to believe that such a life was possible, that he could leave his past behind and become someone worthy of her love. Instead, he'd ridden away one morning without a word, leaving her to face the consequences of his choices alone. He told himself it was for her own good, that she was better off without him. But the truth was simpler and more shameful. He'd been afraid. Afraid of responsibility, afraid of failure, afraid of discovering that he was incapable of being the man she deserved. By the time he'd found the courage to return, months later, the farmhouse was ashes, and Sarah was buried in the cemetery outside Santa Fe. The wooden cross bore two names, hers and the baby that had died with her, the child he'd never known he'd fathered. The locals told him it had been Apaches, but Boone knew better. It had been his enemies, men who'd tracked him down and taken their revenge on the only person who'd ever mattered to him. He'd stood at that grave for hours, hat in hand, trying to find words for feelings that had no names. The guilt was a living thing inside him, clawing at his chest and stealing his breath. He'd failed them both, abandoned them when they needed him most, and their deaths would be on his conscience forever. Now, looking down at the baby in his arms, he felt that same crushing weight of responsibility. This child was helpless, defenseless, completely dependent on him for survival. The smart thing, the safe thing, would be to walk away, but he'd already walked away once, and the cost of that choice haunted him still. He wrapped the child in a spare shirt, the soft cotton providing additional warmth and comfort. The baby settled against his chest, its tiny fist gripping his shirt, as if already understanding that this man was all that stood between him and the world that wanted him dead. Its breathing began to slow and deepen, and for the first time since he'd found it, the child seemed to relax. Boone tucked the baby close to his body, feeling the rapid flutter of its heartbeat against his chest. The child's trust was absolute and terrifying, a weight that settled on his shoulders like a lead blanket. He'd never been responsible for anything more vulnerable than a horse, and the magnitude of what he was taking on began to sink in. He turned east toward Water Bend, the decision made without conscious thought. The baby would need milk, warmth, shelter. He'd figure out the rest as he went. The horse seemed to sense his new purpose, stepping out with renewed energy despite the additional burden it carried. Water Bend was the kind of place that squatted between trails like it was hoping not to be noticed. One saloon, two stores, a crooked church, and a sheriff too old for the badge. The town had the tired look of a place that had seen better days and wasn't expecting them to return. The buildings were weathered gray, their paint peeling and their foundations settling into the hard-packed earth. The main street was little more than a wide spot in the trail, rutted by wagon wheels and marked by the droppings of countless horses. A few stores lined the street, their false fronts giving the illusion of prosperity, but their windows were dusty and their goods sparse. This was a place where people came to disappear, to lose themselves in the anonymity of a town that asked no questions and expected no answers. Boone rode in near dusk, the sky painted in shades of purple and gold that seemed to set the clouds on fire. The saloon had a busted piano that wheezed and groaned when the wind hit it just right, and more flies than beer circled the sticky tables. The batwing doors hung crooked on their hinges, and the porch sagged under the weight of too many boots and too many years. A few horses stood hipshot at the hitching post, their riders probably the kind of men who asked few questions and answered fewer. These were hard men, the kind who'd seen too much of the world's ugliness and had learned to keep their mouths shut about it. They drink their whiskey in silence and ride out before dawn, leaving no trace of their passing except the money they left behind. The saloon's interior was even less inviting than its exterior. The floorboards were warped and stained. The walls were covered with old wanted posters and faded photographs of people who were probably long dead. The bar was a single plank of wood supported by barrels, and the mirror behind it was so cracked and spotted that it reflected nothing but broken images. He walked in slow, baby bundled under his coat, his movements careful and deliberate. The saloon was dim, lit by oil lamps that cast dancing shadows on the walls and filled the air with the smell of kerosene and smoke. A handful of men sat at tables, nursing drinks and playing cards with the quiet intensity of people who had little else to do with their time. The conversation stopped when he entered, every eye turning to assess the newcomer. It was the kind of scrutiny that could turn deadly in a heartbeat, the careful evaluation of predators deciding whether he was prey or competition. Boone kept his face neutral, his hand near his gun, as he approached the bar. "Don't serve your kind," the barkeep muttered without looking up from the glass he was wiping. He was a thin man with gray hair and the kind of face that suggested he'd seen too much of the world's ugliness. His movements were economical, practiced, the gestures of a man who'd been doing the same job for too many years. "My kind?" Boone asked, keeping his voice level and non-threatening. The baby stirred against his chest, and he shifted slightly to keep it hidden. "Brooders with blankets." The barkeep's voice carried the weight of experience, the knowledge of a man who'd seen too many dangerous men carrying too many dangerous secrets. Boone laid a silver coin on the bar, the metal ringing against the wood with a clear musical sound. The coin was clean and bright, the kind of money that commanded respect even in a place like this. "Got a baby, not a disease." The barkeep glanced at the coin, then at Boone's face, his eyes taking in the hard lines and old scars that marked him as a man who'd lived through violence. Something in the gunfighter's eyes must have convinced him, because he poured whiskey anyway, good whiskey, not the rotgut he probably served to most of his customers. The whiskey was smooth and warm, burning away some of the day's tension and exhaustion. It was the kind of drink that cost real money, and Boone found himself wondering why the barkeep had chosen to serve him the good stuff. Maybe it was the silver coin, or maybe it was something in his face that spoke of desperation and determination. He sipped the drink slowly, savoring the burn and the brief respite it provided from his troubles. The baby remained quiet against his chest, sleeping the deep sleep of the very young, and for a moment he allowed himself to hope that maybe, just maybe, he could pull this off. He asked around, quiet-like, keeping his voice low and his questions casual. "Anyone know of a woman named Quinn? Anyone know where a child might be safe?" The answers came in shrugs or silence, but he caught the way some men's eyes shifted when he mentioned the name. Quinn's reputation cast a long shadow even in death, and people were reluctant to speak of him even in whispers. One old-timer, deep in his cups and past caring about consequences, leaned close and spoke in a voice like rustling leaves. "Quinn's been dead 10 years, friend, but his ghosts still walk. You'd best be careful what names you speak in the dark." The words sent a chill down Boone's spine, but he pressed on. "What about the baby?" The old man's eyes went wide, and he shook his head vigorously. "No baby. Quinn made sure of that, said he wouldn't curse the world with his spawn. You best leave that name alone, friend. Nothing good comes from digging up the past." By nightfall, he found a room upstairs, paying extra for privacy and a lock on the door. The floorboards creaked under his boots with every step, and the walls were thin enough that he could hear every sound from the street below. The room was small and sparse, furnished with nothing but a bed, a chair, and a washstand that had seen better days. The window looked out onto the main street, giving him a clear view of anyone who might be coming or going. It was a tactical advantage, the kind of thing that had kept him alive in dangerous places, but it also meant he'd get little sleep. Every sound would wake him, every shadow would demand investigation. He cribbed the baby in a whiskey crate lined with old shirts, making sure the makeshift bed was soft and warm. The child settled into it with a contented sigh, its small body relaxing into the cotton padding. For the first time since he'd found it, the baby seemed truly at peace. He watched the child sleep, studying the tiny features and trying to imagine what kind of man it might grow up to be. The baby's face was peaceful in sleep, its mouth slightly open, its hands curled into small fists. There was something beautiful about it, something that spoke of innocence and possibility. But there was also something troubling about the child's resemblance to the man whose name appeared on the wanted poster. The dark hair, the strong jaw, the determined set of the mouth, all of it reminded him of the stories he'd heard about Ezekiel Quinn. What if the poster was true? What if he was carrying the spawn of the most dangerous man who'd ever lived? The baby's tiny fists twitched like it fought battles in its dreams, and Boone found himself wondering what battles such a small thing could know. What enemies haunted its unconscious mind? What kind of legacy had it inherited from a father who'd been feared across 3 territories? He called him Ash, don't know why. Maybe 'cause that's what was left when everything burns, and Boone had seen enough fires to know that sometimes the ashes were all that remained of good intentions. Or maybe because the child's hair was dark as soot, or because he'd been born from the ruins of someone else's life. The name felt right somehow. It was simple, strong, the kind of name that could belong to anyone. It carried no weight of expectation, no burden of history. It was a clean slate, a fresh start, everything that Boone hoped this child could have. Next morning, Boone was 2 steps from the saloon when he saw them. Riders, 4 of them, sitting their horses with the easy confidence of men who were used to being feared. They were professionals, the kind of men who killed for money and slept well at night. Their spurs were polished, their rifles slung low and ready, and they carried themselves with the casual arrogance of predators who'd never met their match. One held a yellowed poster, and even from a distance, Boone didn't need to see it close to know what it contained. The paper fluttered in the morning breeze, and he could make out the bold letters that spelled out a death sentence for an innocent child. They'd come for Ash. The leader was a big man with a red beard and cold blue eyes that seemed to see everything and care about nothing. He wore a deputy's badge pinned to his vest, but it was the kind of badge that could be bought or stolen, and the men with him didn't look like any lawmen Boone had ever seen. They looked like killers, plain and simple, the kind of men who'd do anything for the right price. His companions were cut from the same cloth, hard men with dead eyes and quick hands. They wore their guns like other men wore their clothes, as natural extensions of their bodies. These weren't desperate drifters or town bullies. These were professionals, and they'd come a long way to collect their bounty. The red-bearded man was scanning the street with the methodical precision of a hunter, his eyes taking in every detail, every possible hiding place. He was systematic, thorough, the kind of man who left nothing to chance. When his gaze passed over Boone, it lingered for a moment, and Boone felt the weight of that scrutiny like a physical touch. Boone slipped out the back of the saloon, moving with the practiced silence of a man who had learned to ghost through dangerous places. He developed these skills over years of running from the law, of avoiding men who wanted him dead or alive. Every step was carefully placed, every movement calculated to avoid detection. The alley behind the saloon was narrow and cluttered with trash, providing perfect cover for a man who knew how to use shadows. He moved from one hiding place to another, always keeping the building between himself and the street, until he reached the stable where he'd left his horse. He saddled up in silence, his movements quick and efficient, his hands steady despite the adrenaline that was beginning to course through his veins. The horse sensed his urgency and stood still, ears forward, ready to run. The animal's intelligence was a blessing. It seemed to understand that their lives might depend on speed and silence. Ash was still sleeping, bundled against his chest in the makeshift sling he'd fashioned from an old shirt. The baby's breathing was steady and deep, and his small body was warm against Boone's ribs. The child seemed to sense nothing of the danger that surrounded them, secure in the cocoon of warmth and protection that Boone had created. He rode north without stopping, Ash bundled against his chest, the baby's warmth a constant reminder of what he was protecting. The child slept through most of the ride, waking only to cry briefly before settling back into slumber. Each cry was like a knife through Boone's heart, a reminder of how vulnerable and dependent the baby was. The country they traveled through was harsh and unforgiving, broken by deep arroyos and wind-carved mesas that offered both shelter and danger. It was the kind of landscape that could hide an army or conceal a single man, depending on how well he knew its secrets. Boone had ridden this country before, and he used every trick he'd learned to cover their trail. From there it was run, hide, ride. Every town brought whispers and sideways glances, every hill might conceal watching eyes. The posters were everywhere, stapled to trees like autumn leaves, nailed to fence posts and building walls. The reward had grown, he noticed, from $5,000 to $7,000, more money than most men would see in a lifetime. The bounty hunters came in waves, each group more professional than the last. Some were obviously amateurs, driven by greed and desperation, but others were seasoned professionals who knew their trade. Boone learned to recognize the signs, the way they sat their horses, the quality of their equipment, the cold calculation in their eyes. He developed a routine, a pattern of movement that kept them one step ahead of their pursuers. Never stay in one place too long, never follow the same trail twice, never trust anyone completely. It was exhausting, nerve-wracking work, but it was the only way to keep Ash alive. They stayed one night in a line shack near Devil's Canyon, sharing the space with an old prospector who asked no questions and offered them beans and coffee without expecting payment. The man was ancient, weathered by years of sun and wind, but his eyes were kind and his hands were gentle when he held the baby. "That's a fighter you got there," the prospector said, watching Ash grip his gnarled finger with surprising strength. "Takes after his daddy, I reckon." Boone almost corrected him, almost explained that he wasn't the child's father, but something stopped him. Maybe it was the way the old man's eyes crinkled when he smiled, or maybe it was the realization that, in all the ways that mattered, he was becoming exactly that, a father. The prospector's cabin was primitive but clean, a single room with a stone fireplace and furniture made from rough-hewn logs. The man had been alone for so long that he'd forgotten how to make small talk, but he was generous with his meager supplies and asked no awkward questions about why a man might be traveling alone with a baby. Another night they slept under the stars, wrapped in blankets beside a dying fire. The desert night was cold, clear, filled with the sound of coyotes calling to each other across the darkness. Ash had cried for hours, his small body racked with hunger and discomfort, and Boone had walked him in circles, singing half-remembered songs his own mother had sung before the fever took her. The songs were fragments, pieces of melody and verse that came back to him across the years. His mother had been a gentle woman, worn down by poverty and hardship, but never broken by it. She died when he was 12, leaving him alone in a world that had no use for orphaned boys. He'd never thought about her much since then, but holding Ash brought back memories of her soft voice and kind hands. Finally, the baby had settled, his cries fading to whimpers and then to silence. Boone had dozed fitfully, one hand on his gun, the other on the child's chest, feeling the steady rhythm of his breathing. Every sound in the night had made him tense, every shadow had demanded investigation. Ash grew in the weeks that followed, his eyes sharp as flint, watching everything with the intensity of someone learning the world's rules. He was a quick learner, already beginning to recognize Boone's voice and face. When Boone spoke to him, the baby would turn his head, tracking the sound with growing awareness. The child's grip was surprisingly strong for something so small, and he would hold onto Boone's finger like he was holding on for dear life. His cries grew stronger, more demanding, and Boone found himself learning to interpret the different sounds: hunger, discomfort, fear, simple loneliness. The baby was a fighter, he realized. Whatever blood ran in his veins, it wasn't the blood of someone who gave up easily. Feeding the child was a constant challenge. Boone had to learn to mix formula from canned milk and sugar, to heat bottles over campfires, to judge the temperature by feel. He made mistakes, but he learned quickly, driven by the knowledge that the baby's life depended on his ability to adapt and improvise. Boone didn't sleep much during those long weeks on the trail. When he did manage to close his eyes, he dreamt of fire and blood, of voices calling out in the darkness. Of Quinn. Of a voice in the dark saying, "He ain't yours." The dreams were always the same. A man in black standing over a grave, laughing with a sound like breaking glass, his eyes reflecting flames that never died. In the dreams, Quinn was tall and thin, dressed in a black coat that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. His face was pale, almost ghostly, and his smile was the kind that made strong men reach for their guns. He would stand there in the dream darkness, pointing a finger at Boone like a judge pronouncing sentence, and his voice would echo with the authority of the grave itself. "You can't save him," Quinn would say, his words carrying the weight of prophecy. "He's mine. He's always been mine. Blood calls to blood, and the sins of the father will be visited upon the son." Boone would wake from these dreams with his heart pounding and his shirt soaked with sweat, the baby's soft breathing the only thing that grounded him in reality. He'd reach out to touch Ash's chest, feeling the steady rise and fall that proved the child was still alive, still fighting, still depending on him for protection. The dreams were getting worse, more vivid, more frequent. Sometimes he'd wake to find himself reaching for his gun, responding to threats that existed only in his sleeping mind. It was exhaustion, he told himself. The constant vigilance, the endless running, the weight of responsibility, it was wearing him down, making him see dangers where none existed. But deep down, he wondered if the dreams were something more, if Quinn's ghost was somehow reaching out from beyond the grave, trying to claim the child that bore his name. It was a foolish thought, the kind of superstition that belonged to old women and frightened children, but out here in the vast emptiness of the desert, it was easy to believe in things that civilized men dismissed as nonsense. He made it to Widow's Hollow in early fall, when the leaves were turning gold and the air had the sharp bite of coming winter. The seasons changed slowly in the desert, marked more by the angle of the sun than by any dramatic shift in temperature, but there was a quality to the light that spoke of endings and new beginnings. The town wasn't on any maps, just a collection of ramshackle cabins and lean tasks clustered around a natural spring. It was the kind of place where people went to disappear, to leave their old lives behind like snakeskin. The buildings were weathered and sun-bleached, constructed from whatever materials could be found or stolen, and the streets were nothing more than dirt paths worn smooth by countless feet. Widow's Hollow was surrounded by box canyons and natural barriers that made it almost impossible to find unless you knew exactly where to look. The approach was treacherous, a narrow trail that wound through formations of red rock and over loose scree that could send a horse tumbling to its death. It was the perfect place for people who didn't want to be found, and Boone had heard stories about the kinds of men who made their homes there. The settlement had earned its name honestly. It was full of women whose husbands had died violent deaths, who'd come here to start over without the burden of their pasts. They were hard women, survivors who'd learned to depend on no one but themselves. They asked no questions and expected no explanations, understanding that everyone who came to Widow's Hollow was running from something. There he found Lorna. She was white-haired, blind in one eye, sharp as a Bowie knife. The good eye was pale blue, almost colorless, but it missed nothing. She lived in a half-burnt cabin with a big dog and a bigger shotgun, and she had the kind of reputation that made even hard men think twice before crossing her. The cabin sat at the edge of the settlement, partially hidden by a stand of cottonwoods that provided both shade and concealment. Half of it had been destroyed by fire years ago, but instead of rebuilding, Lorna had simply walled off the damaged section and continued living in what remained. The result was a structure that looked like it had been designed by someone with a twisted sense of humor, but it was solid and defensible. The dog was a mastiff mix, gray-muzzled and wise, with scars that told stories of old battles fought and won. Its eyes were intelligent and alert, and it seemed to understand that its job was to protect its mistress from a world that had already taken too much from her. When Boone approached the cabin, the dog rose slowly to its feet, not growling but making its presence known. Lorna emerged from the cabin with her shotgun cradled in her arms, her good eye taking in every detail of the stranger who dared to approach her home. She was small and wiry, with the kind of toughness that came from surviving things that would have broken lesser people. Her white hair was pulled back in a severe bun, and her dress was practical and well-mended. "You lost, stranger?" she asked, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd faced down worse men than him. Looking for a place to rest, Boone replied, keeping his hands visible and his voice respectful. "Got a baby with me." "Baby?" Her tone softened slightly, and she tilted her head to listen. Ash chose that moment to make a small sound, a soft cooing that seemed to echo in the stillness of the canyon. "Show me," she commanded, and Boone carefully pulled back the blanket that covered the child. Lorna's expression changed completely when she saw Ash. Her hard features softened, and she approached with the careful movements of someone who understood how precious and fragile life could be. The dog followed her, its tail wagging slowly, and it sniffed at the baby with gentle curiosity. She let him stay close. Ash didn't cry when she held him. The moment she took the child from Boone's arms, the baby settled into her embrace with a contented sigh. His small body relaxed, and his eyes focused on her face with the kind of trust that spoke of instinctive recognition. "This one's got warrior blood," she said, her voice filled with wonder. "He knows friend from foe already. That's a gift, that is. Means he was born to survive things that would kill lesser men." Her good eye studied the baby with the intensity of someone reading signs in smoke, taking in every detail of his face and form. There was something almost mystical about the way she held him, as if she could see things in the child that were invisible to others. The dog, meanwhile, had appointed itself as Ash's guardian. It lay down beside Lorna's chair, its massive head resting on its paws, but its eyes never left the baby. When Ash reached out with his tiny hands, the dog allowed him to grab its ears and pull its tail without complaint, showing the kind of patience that spoke of an understanding deeper than words. Over the following days, Lorna proved to be exactly what Boone and Ash needed. She had experience with children, having raised several of her own before the world took them away from her. She showed Boone how to properly mix formula, how to burp the baby, how to recognize the signs of illness or distress. But more than that, she provided something that Boone hadn't realized he needed: companionship. Someone to talk to, someone who understood the weight of responsibility he carried. She had her own stories of loss and survival, and she shared them in the quiet hours when Ash slept and the fire burned low. Over strong coffee and comfortable silence, she told him the truth about the bounty poster. The coffee was bitter and black, strong enough to wake the dead, served in chipped cups that had seen better days. Outside, the wind rattled the windows and made the cabin creak like an old ship riding out a storm. "The baby ain't Quinn's," she said, her voice matter of fact, as if she were discussing the weather. "That poster, a lie. Quinn had no kin, he made sure of it, killed his own brother over a woman, swore he'd never have children to carry on his curse." Boone felt a mixture of relief and confusion. If Ash wasn't Quinn's child, then who was he, and why had someone gone to such lengths to create a false bounty poster? Then who? Boone asked, though part of him already suspected the answer. "Baby's the last of the DeWitt line. Cattle kings, rich as sin and twice as mean. The wrong folks found out about him, and they decided it was easier to blame Quinn than admit a baron's bastard lived. The DeWitt name carried weight in these parts, and not all of it was good. They owned half the territory, had judges in their pockets and politicians at their table. They were the kind of people who bought and sold human lives like cattle, who saw the world as their personal property to be managed and controlled. But they were also proud, and pride could make men do terrible things. The thought of illegitimate children of bloodlines that couldn't be controlled would be anathema to people like that. They'd kill to protect their reputation, to maintain the fiction that they were somehow better than the common people they exploited. "Why kill him?" Boone asked, though he was beginning to understand the twisted logic behind it. "Land, power, guilt. Pick your poison." The DeWitt patriarch had a wandering eye and a weakness for saloon girls. This baby's mama was probably some dove who caught his fancy. When she turned up pregnant, it became a problem that needed solving. Lorna's voice carried the weight of experience, the knowledge of someone who'd seen too much of the world's ugliness. She'd lived through the kind of violence that powerful men visited upon the innocent, and she understood the casual cruelty that wealth and privilege could breed. "So they killed her," Boone said, the pieces falling into place. "Killed her and tried to kill the baby too, but someone got wind of it, spirited the child away, probably hoped to collect the bounty themselves, but something went wrong. Maybe they grew a conscience, maybe they just got scared. Either way, the baby ended up in that saddlebag and you found him." The story made sense in a horrible way. It explained the quality of the horse and tack, the careful way the baby had been wrapped and protected. Someone had cared enough to try to save Ash, even if they'd ultimately failed to see it through. "And Quinn?" Boone asked. "Dead man's reputation makes a convenient scapegoat. Who's gonna question a bounty on Quinn's spawn? Who's gonna look too closely at the details when there's that much money involved?" It was brilliant in its simplicity. By invoking Quinn's name, the DeWitts had ensured that every bounty hunter and desperado in the territory would be looking for Ash. They'd turned the baby into a target without having to get their own hands dirty, and they'd done it in a way that would never come back to them. Boone didn't sleep that night, not from fear, but from a kind of cold clarity that settled over him like a blanket. The pieces were falling into place, and the picture they formed was uglier than he'd imagined. Ash wasn't a curse or a devil's spawn. He was a threat to men who'd killed to build their fences and cities, who'd destroyed lives to protect their own interests. And now Boone, a thief by trade and a killer by necessity, had become a guardian to the one person who could bring down an empire. It was ironic, really. He'd spent his life running from responsibility, avoiding the kind of commitments that tied a man down, and now he'd found himself bound to something more precious than gold or freedom. He stood at the window of Lorna's cabin, watching the stars wheel overhead in their ancient patterns. Ash slept peacefully in his makeshift crib, his small chest rising and falling with the steady rhythm of innocent dreams. The baby had no idea of the forces arrayed against him, no understanding of the blood and money that would be spilled in his name. But Boone understood, and the knowledge changed something fundamental inside him. He'd been drifting for years, moving from town to town without purpose or direction, living from one day to the next without thought for the future. Now, for the first time in his adult life, he had something worth fighting for. 3 weeks passed in relative peace. Ash grew stronger with each passing day, his cries louder and more demanding, his grip more determined. Lorna taught Boone the finer points of child care, showing him how to make proper bottles from glass and rubber, how to mix formula from canned milk and sugar with the precision of a chemist. The baby took to solid food with enthusiasm, grabbing at everything with sticky fingers and showing the kind of healthy appetite that spoke of good health and strong constitution. He was beginning to recognize faces, to respond to voices, to show the first signs of the personality that would define him as he grew. During those peaceful weeks, Boone allowed himself to imagine a different kind of life, one where he and Ash could settle down somewhere safe, where they could build the kind of home that he'd never had as a child. He pictured teaching the boy to ride, to read, to be the kind of man who built things instead of destroying them. But peace was a luxury men like Boone couldn't afford for long. The world had a way of intruding on even the most carefully constructed sanctuaries, and he'd always known that this respite was temporary. The question wasn't whether they'd be found, but when. They found him on a Tuesday morning, when the sun was just beginning to paint the canyon walls with gold. A scout spotted boot tracks near the river, fresh sign that spoke of multiple riders moving with purpose. Smoke by the ridge, thin and gray against the morning sky, told the story of a cold camp that had been struck before dawn. Boone saw the glint of binoculars on the canyon ledge, the sun catching metal like a signal fire. They were being watched, studied, evaluated by men who knew their trade. He counted at least 7 riders, maybe more, all armed and professional. These weren't the desperate amateurs he'd been dodging for weeks. These were specialists, brought in to finish what the others had failed to accomplish. The end had come, as he'd always known it would. The only question now was whether he could buy enough time for Lorna to get Ash to safety. He found Lorna in the cabin, calmly preparing breakfast as if this were just another ordinary morning. But he could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her good eye kept flicking toward the windows. She'd sensed the danger, too, had probably spotted the signs even before he had. "How many?" she asked, without looking up from the stove. "7 that I can see, probably more." She nodded, her movements becoming more deliberate, more purposeful. Professional as they come. Lorna set down her spatula and turned to face him, her expression grave. "Then this is it." Boone kissed Ash's forehead, feeling the baby's soft skin against his lips, breathing in the clean smell of innocence that would soon be lost to the world's violence. The child looked up at him with those dark eyes, and for a moment Boone saw something that might have been understanding, as if the baby somehow knew what was coming. "Told you I was no good," he whispered, his voice rough with emotion. "But I'll buy you time." He pressed his backup gun into Lorna's hands, a small pistol that he'd kept hidden for emergencies. Her fingers closed around it with the familiarity of someone who'd held weapons before, who understood their weight and purpose. "Take him north," he instructed. "There's a trail through Devil's Canyon that leads to the old mining camps. From there, you can make it to the railroad. Get him on a train heading east, anywhere but here. And if you don't come back, then you keep running, Mexico maybe, or Canada, somewhere the DeWitt name doesn't reach." Lorna nodded, her expression showing none of the fear he'd expected. She'd been through this before, had made these kinds of desperate calculations when survival was measured in minutes rather than years. She understood the stakes, understood what was being asked of her. "I'll take care of him," she promised, and Boone knew she would. If anyone could keep Ash safe, it was this hard-eyed woman who'd already survived more than most people could imagine. He tied his Colt low on his hip, checking the action one final time. The gun was old but reliable, its weight familiar and comforting against his leg. He'd killed men with this weapon, had saved his own life more times than he could count. Now it would have to serve one last time, in a fight that he knew he couldn't win. His rifle was fully loaded and he had extra ammunition in his belt. It wouldn't be enough, it never was, but it would have to do. He wasn't trying to win this fight, just to delay it long enough for Lorna and Ash to escape. He saddled his horse with practiced efficiency, every movement economical and precise. The animal seemed to sense what was coming, stepping high and nervous, its ears constantly moving as it scanned for threats. This horse had carried him through danger before, and it would do so again, even if this time there might be no safe harbor waiting at the end of the trail. As he prepared to ride out, Boone took one last look at the cabin that had been his sanctuary. Lorna was already moving, gathering supplies and preparing for the journey ahead. Ash was bundled in his blanket, his small face peaceful in sleep, unaware that his world was about to change forever. Then he rode to Devil's Bluff, following the trail that would lead him to his final confrontation. The horse moved with the smooth gait of an animal that understood its rider's purpose, and Boone found himself settling into the rhythm of what might be his last ride. The bluff was a natural amphitheater, carved from red rock by centuries of wind and water. It was a place where sound echoed and magnified, where the slightest movement could be seen from miles away. It was also a place where a man could make his stand, where he could choose the ground on which he'd fight his last battle. They were waiting, 7 men dressed in dust and hatred, their faces hard with the kind of determination that came from knowing they were close to their goal. Their leader wore a red sash and the DeWitt crest on his silver buckle, marking him as more than just a hired gun. He was younger than Boone had expected, probably the old man's son or nephew, sent to clean up the family mess with his own hands. The men had spread out in a loose semicircle, each one positioned to provide covering fire for the others. They were professionals, experienced in the kind of work that left no witnesses and few questions. Their horses were good ones, well-rested and ready for a long chase if necessary. But they'd made one mistake. They'd assumed that Boone would try to run. They'd positioned themselves to cut off escape routes, to prevent him from reaching the safety of the Badlands. They hadn't considered that he might choose to fight, that he might value someone else's life more than his own. Boone dismounted slowly, his hands clearly visible, his movements deliberate and non-threatening. The morning sun was at his back, giving him a slight advantage, but it wouldn't be enough to overcome the odds he faced. Still, he'd been in worse situations before, and he'd always found a way to survive. "I got no baby," he called out, his voice carrying across the canyon, echoing off the rock walls. "You're lying," the leader spat, his face flushed with anger and something else, fear maybe, or the kind of guilt that came from knowing you were about to murder an innocent child. "We know you have him. We know you're the one who's been running our men ragged across 3 territories. Boone didn't argue. Words were useless now, had been useless from the moment he'd decided to take responsibility for Ash's life. This was about more than money or revenge. It was about power, about the kind of control that rich men thought they could exercise over the lives of others. The leader was nervous, Boone realized. This wasn't the kind of work he was used to, and the weight of family expectations was showing in his tense shoulders and rapid breathing. He was dangerous precisely because he was afraid, because fear made men unpredictable and desperate. "Just give us the baby," the leader continued, his voice taking on a pleading quality. "Nobody else has to die. You can ride away from this, start over somewhere else. We'll even pay you for your trouble." It was a lie, of course. They'd never let him live, not after what he'd seen, not after what he knew about their family's dirty secrets. But the offer revealed something important. They were more afraid of him than they were letting on. They'd rather buy him off than fight him if they thought there was a chance he'd accept. Boone's response was to draw his gun. The canyon lit with thunder as 7 weapons spoke almost simultaneously. Dust and lead filled the air, and the sound echoed off the rock walls, multiplied and amplified until it seemed like the world itself was screaming in rage and pain. Boone's first shot took the man on the left, the bullet catching him in the chest and spinning him around in a pirouette of death. The man's rifle discharged into the air as he fell, and his horse reared in terror, adding to the chaos of the moment. His second shot went wide as a bullet creased his shoulder, sending fire down his arm and nearly causing him to drop his gun. But his third shot found its mark, and another man crumpled to the ground, his life bleeding out into the desert sand. The remaining men had taken cover behind rocks and their horses, making themselves harder targets while maintaining their ability to return fire. They were good at this, experienced in the kind of violence that left men dead and questions unanswered. Boone rolled to his left, seeking cover behind a boulder that provided protection from most angles. A rifle bullet chipped rock inches from his head, showering him with sharp fragments that drew blood from his cheek. He could feel the warm trickle of blood running down his face, but he ignored it, focused entirely on the immediate threat. He fell once, got up, driven by a determination that bordered on the supernatural. A rifle bullet had shattered his left collarbone, and his left arm hung useless at his side, but his right hand still worked, and his Colt still had bullets. Pain was just another enemy to be ignored, another obstacle to overcome. The leader was shouting orders, trying to coordinate his men's movements, but the acoustics of the canyon made it difficult to understand what he was saying. The words echoed and overlapped, creating a confusion that worked in Boone's favor. If they couldn't communicate effectively, they couldn't fight effectively. He fell again, this time from a bullet that carved a groove across his scalp, painting his vision red and making his ears ring. Blood ran into his eyes, but he could still see well enough to shoot, could still distinguish between enemies and shadows. His horse had fled, spooked by the gunfire, leaving him afoot in the middle of the killing ground. But 5 men didn't rise when the echoes finally died away. They lay still in the dust, their blood already attracting flies, their weapons scattered around them like discarded toys. The morning sun beat down on their bodies, and the desert began the process of reclaiming them, of returning them to the earth from which they'd come. 2 men remained, the leader and an older gunfighter whose face was marked by old scars and older violence. They were wounded, desperate, but still dangerous, the kind of men who'd fight to the death rather than admit defeat. The older gunfighter made his move first, rising from cover with his rifle ready, trying to get a clean shot at Boone's position, but Boone had been expecting it, had been watching for exactly this kind of desperate gambit. His bullet caught the man in the throat, cutting off his battle cry and dropping him like a stone. The leader came last, his gun empty, his face a mask of blood and fury. He'd drawn a knife, a long blade that gleamed in the morning sun, and he was charging with the kind of desperate courage that came from knowing there was no retreat. Boone caught him with a bullet to the heart, the impact lifting the younger man off his feet and slamming him backward into the canyon wall. He slid down slowly, leaving a red smear on the stone, his eyes wide with the kind of surprise that comes to those who have never believed their own mortality. When it was done, Boone collapsed under the dying sun, his body finally giving in to the punishment it had endured. The silence was absolute, broken only by the wind and the distant cry of a hawk that had been circling overhead, waiting for the violence to end so it could claim its share of the carnage. He could feel his life leaking out of him, could taste copper in his mouth and feel the weakness spreading through his limbs. But he'd kept his promise. He'd bought Ash time, had given Lorna the chance she needed to get the boy to safety. The sun was setting when Lorna found him, painting the canyon walls in shades of red and gold that seemed appropriate for the scene of so much violence. She'd come looking when she heard the gunshots, bringing her medical supplies and her stubborn refusal to let good men die if she could help it. Ash gurgled from her shawl, his dark eyes bright and curious, taking in the world around him with the fearless wonder of the very young. The baby seemed to understand that something important had happened, that the world had changed in some fundamental way, but he showed no fear, no awareness of the danger that had been so close to claiming him. Boone smiled weakly, his voice barely a whisper, each word an effort that cost him more than he could afford. "Told you, I ain't no hero." Lorna grinned, her weathered face creasing into 1,000 wrinkles, her good eye bright with tears she refused to shed. "Maybe, but that boy's still breathing." It was enough. It was everything. They buried the men in silence, dragging the bodies to a dry wash where the next flash flood would scatter their bones and erase all trace of their passing. The desert was good at keeping secrets, at hiding the evidence of man's violence beneath layers of sand and stone. In a few years, there would be nothing left to mark this place as different from any other. They burned the posters they found in the saddlebags, watching the yellowed paper curl and blacken in the flames. The reward notices went up like dry tinder, releasing their poison into the air as smoke and ash. Let the wind have their names and their threats, let the desert claim their lies and their hatred. The DeWitt family would send more men eventually, but not for a while. They'd have to regroup, rethink their strategy, find new ways to deal with the problem that Ash represented. And by then, the boy would be older, stronger, better able to protect himself. By then, he might even understand what his life was worth and why so many men had been willing to die for him. Years passed like water flowing through desert sand, measured not in calendars but in the small milestones of childhood. Ash grew strong and clever and stubborn, developing the kind of personality that made it clear he'd inherited more than just his father's blood. He learned to walk on the cabin's wooden floors, taking his first hesitant steps between Lorna's chair and Boone's outstretched arms. He learned to speak in the mixture of English and Spanish that Lorna preferred, his first words a blend of both languages that reflected the complex heritage of the borderlands. Agua for water, mas for more, papa for the man who'd chosen to be his father. Each word was a small victory, a sign that he was growing into his own person. The people of Widow's Hollow called him the boy who outlived a bounty, and he wore the title with the quiet pride of someone who'd earned it through no choice of his own. He was a celebrity of sorts, the child who'd survived what no child should have to survive, and the other residents of the settlement treated him with a mixture of affection and respect. But to Boone, he was simply Ash, a child who laughed at Lorna's stories, who cried when he skinned his knees, who trusted completely in the love of the man who'd chosen to be his father. The boy had no memory of those early days, no understanding of the violence that had swirled around him like a storm. To him, Boone had always been there, had always been the steady presence that made his world safe and predictable. Boone's wounds had healed, though his left arm never worked quite right again. The shoulder had been shattered too badly to mend properly, and he'd lost much of the strength and mobility on that side. But he'd adapted, learned to do everything one-handed, and in time the limitation had become just another part of who he was. He'd stayed in the hollow, becoming something he'd never thought possible, a father. Not by blood, but by choice, by the daily decision to put someone else's needs before his own. It was harder than he'd expected, more demanding than any job he'd ever taken on, but it was also more rewarding than anything he'd ever done. He taught Ash to ride, starting with a gentle old mare that wouldn't spook at sudden movements or loud noises. The boy took to it naturally, showing the kind of instinctive understanding of horses that spoke of good blood and natural ability. By the time he was 5, he could ride better than most grown men, and he'd developed the kind of partnership with his horse that came from mutual respect and understanding. He taught him to shoot, starting with an old .22 rifle that was light enough for small hands to handle. Ash had a natural eye for it, the kind of steady hand and patient focus that made for good marksmanship. But more important than the technical skills was the understanding that came with them, the knowledge that guns were tools, not toys, and that the power to take life came with responsibilities that couldn't be ignored. But most importantly, he taught him to be better than the men who'd wanted him dead. To be kind when kindness was possible, to be hard when hardness was necessary, but never to be cruel for its own sake. The boy had a naturally generous spirit, the kind of heart that wanted to help others, and Boone nurtured that quality while teaching him the practical skills he'd need to survive in a world that wasn't always kind to good men. Boone never told him the whole story of his origins, never spoke of the DeWitt name or the bounty that had once been on his head. There would be time for that when the boy was older, when he was strong enough to handle the truth about his heritage and the forces that had shaped his early life. Instead, he told him simpler truths, that sometimes you find something worth more than gold, more than revenge, more than the freedom to drift from town to town without looking back. Sometimes you find a baby in a saddlebag, and you realize you trade your whole damn soul to keep him breathing. The boy would learn the truth eventually, when he was old enough to understand the complexities of adult motivations and the weight of family legacy. About his real father, about the DeWitt blood that ran in his veins, about the men who died to protect him from those who would use him as a pawn in their games of power and control. But for now, he was just Ash. A child who laughed at Lorna's stories, who cried when he skinned his knees, who trusted completely in the love of the man who'd chosen to be his father. He was growing up strong and healthy, surrounded by people who cared about him, learning the skills he'd need to make his own way in the world. And maybe that was enough. Maybe that was everything. In the quiet moments, when the boy was sleeping and the desert wind whispered through the canyon walls, Boone would sometimes think about the choices he'd made, the path that had led him from being a thief and a drifter to becoming a father and a protector. He'd never planned any of it, had never imagined that his life could take such a dramatic turn. But he'd learned something important in those years, that redemption wasn't about erasing the past, but about choosing to build something better in the present. He couldn't undo the things he'd done, couldn't bring back the people he'd failed to save, but he could pour all of his love and knowledge into raising this one child, into giving him the kind of start in life that Boone himself had never had. It was enough. It was everything. And when the time came for Ash to make his own choices, to forge his own path in the world, Boone would be proud to have played a part in shaping the man he'd become. The sun set over Widow's Hollow, painting the sky in shades of red and gold, and somewhere in the distance, a hawk called out to its mate. Life continued, as it always had, as it always would. And in a small cabin at the edge of the world, a man who'd found his purpose watched over a child who'd given his life meaning, and knew that he'd finally found his way home.